The Korean Mafia boss wasn't meant to fall until she appeared in his car window. She had no idea that the most dangerous man in Seoul was sitting 3 inches away from her, separated by nothing but a sheet of tinted glass. Watching her fix her lipstick like the world wasn't about to change forever. It was a late afternoon in Gangnam, the kind of afternoon where the sun drops low and turns everything golden. The kind of gold that softens the city's hard edges, makes the buildings glow, and tricks you into thinking the world is gentler than it really is. The streets were full of people moving fast. Tailored suits, designer heels, eyes locked forward, chasing deadlines they'd already missed. Abena Obinna was not chasing anything that day. She was simply trying to survive it. Her shift at the boutique fashion studio had run longer than it should have. Her braids had frizzed in the humidity. Her eyeliner had smudged at the corners. And the confidence she'd walked in with that morning, the kind that usually made her untouchable, was quietly threatening to crack right there on the sidewalk. She caught a glimpse of herself in a glass storefront and stopped cold. "Not today," she muttered. That was when she saw it. A sleek, charcoal gray sedan parked just ahead of her, sitting at the curb like it owned the street. Its windows were so deeply tinted they reflected the golden light like a mirror. Dark, polished, perfect. She glanced around. No driver outside. No movement from within. Just an expensive, silent machine minding its business. Good enough. Abena stepped up to the rear passenger window, leaned in close, and pulled her lipstick from her bag. She twisted it open with practiced ease, leaned a little closer, and began carefully painting her lips. "Let's fix you," she whispered to her reflection. She tilted her head, pressed her lips together, checked her braids, and then she smiled at herself. That quiet, satisfied, "Yes girl, you've got this" smile. And then she walked away, just like that. Now, if you are new here, welcome. This is the kind of story that will have you forgetting to breathe. The kind where love doesn't knock politely, it kicks the door in. If you love romance wrapped in danger, tension that builds until you can't take it anymore, and a woman who has no idea the storm she just stepped into, then you are exactly where you need to be. Hit that subscribe button right now. Tap the bell so you never miss a single episode. And drop a comment below. Tell me, did she feel anything in that moment? Because the man inside that car certainly did. Because inside that charcoal gray sedan, behind that impenetrable tinted glass, sat Do-yoon. To the public, a quiet investor. A name attached to clean boardrooms and legitimate companies. In reality, he controlled networks that moved in silence across Seoul. Arms, information, power. Men twice his age studied his name like a warning. Rivals tracked his movements from a distance. Allies never questioned him, because the ones who had were no longer around to question anything. Do-yoon did not feel. That was not an exaggeration. It was a decision he had made years ago and enforced like law. Not fear, not longing, not regret. He had stripped himself of all of it, deliberately, methodically, because feeling things was a liability he couldn't afford. But right now, Do-yoon was frozen. His tablet was in his lap, forgotten. The shipment routes he'd been reviewing, gone from his mind entirely. Because a woman, a complete stranger, had just walked up to his window, used it as her personal mirror, smiled at her own reflection like she had all the peace in the world, and walked away without looking back. He sat in the silence she left behind. And for the first time in years, something shifted in his chest. Something with no name. Something he had no framework for, because he had spent so long making sure he'd never feel it. "Sir?" His driver's voice came cautiously from the front. Do-yoon didn't answer right away. His eyes were still fixed on the spot where she had been standing. "Find her," he said finally. Low, controlled, certain. "Sir." "The woman," Do-yoon repeated. "I want everything." And that, right there, was the moment everything began. Not with a grand gesture. Not with destiny. With a girl fixing her lipstick on a Tuesday, and a man who had never wanted anything he couldn't control, suddenly wanting her. Perfect. Dark, suspenseful, and dropping straight into Do-yoon's world. Here's your transition. The file arrived in 1 hour and 43 minutes. Do-yoon noticed the time. Kim was getting faster. He would not say so. Acknowledgement had a way of making people comfortable, and comfort made people careless, but he noticed. He was seated at the long obsidian desk in his private office on the 34th floor, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over Seoul like a throne overlooking a kingdom. The city glittered beneath him. Restless, layered, full of things moving in the dark that the daylight crowd never saw. He knew most of those things by name. His phone buzzed once. He picked it up. The file opened. Abena Obinna, female, 25, Nigerian national. Visa status, valid. Work permit, active. Current residence, Itaewon District, Seoul. Employer, independent boutique fashion studio, Itaewon. Duration of stay in Seoul, 2 years, 3 months. Criminal record, none. Known affiliations, none. Family, parents based in Lagos, Nigeria. No siblings in Korea. Financial status, stable. Modest income, no debt flags. Do-yoon read it twice. Then he set the phone face down on the desk and leaned back in his chair. Nothing. She was nobody in the way that most people were nobody. No network. No leverage. No reason to appear on anyone's radar, let alone his. She was a young woman who had packed her life into a suitcase, crossed an ocean, and planted herself in a city that didn't speak her first language, and had apparently been doing just fine. He picked the phone back up. He read it a third time. There was a photo attached, pulled from her work permit documentation. It was administrative, flat, the kind of photo designed to capture identity rather than personality. And yet, even in it, something came through. Something in the line of her jaw. The directness of her gaze into the camera. Not performative, not guarded. Just present. Like she had decided, before the shutter clicked, that she had nothing to hide and nothing to prove. Do-yoon studied it longer than he needed to. He told himself it was habit. Pattern recognition. The same way he studied any unknown variable that entered his orbit. He told himself that. He did not sleep well that night. This was not unusual, he rarely did. Sleep had always been something he managed rather than enjoyed, scheduled in precise hours between obligations. But that night, it wasn't strategy keeping him awake. It wasn't the pending arms transfer out of Busan, or the rival syndicate quietly testing his southern borders, or the politician whose silence he was currently renting at considerable expense. It was a smile, private, unhurried, pointed at a reflection that didn't know it was being watched. He lay in the dark of his penthouse and replayed it with the kind of precision he usually reserved for security footage, frame by frame. The way she had leaned toward the glass without hesitation. The way her expression had shifted from mild frustration to quiet focus to something that looked, impossibly, like joy, over lipstick, over her own face in a car window, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, in a city that wasn't even hers. And then she had walked away. No backward glance. No lingering. Just done. Satisfied. Complete in herself. Do-yoon understood power. He had spent his entire adult life mapping it, acquiring it, protecting it. He knew what it looked like in a room, who held it, who performed it, who was quietly bleeding it out without realizing. He could read a boardroom in under 60 seconds. A threat in under 5. But that, whatever she had carried in that moment, he didn't have a word for it. It wasn't power exactly. It was something quieter. Something that didn't need an audience. He found it unreasonably difficult to stop thinking about. Curiosity, he told himself. That's all this is. He was a man who needed to understand things. When something didn't compute, he investigated until it did. This was no different. She was an anomaly, a variable that had briefly intersected his controlled environment, and he was simply running the natural process of analysis. That was all. He closed his eyes, saw the smile again, opened them. By Wednesday, he had changed his morning route. It was a minor adjustment. 15 minutes earlier, a different arterial road through Itaewon before looping back toward the financial district. Easily justified. Traffic patterns in Gangnam had been unpredictable. His driver didn't question it. Nobody questioned Do-yoon's decisions. That was one of the few genuine comforts of his position. The fashion studio sat on a quiet side street, the kind of street that felt tucked away deliberately, like it was catering to people who already knew where they were going. The storefront was small but deliberate. A hand-painted sign, curated pieces arranged in the window with the kind of intention that suggested someone with a real I had placed them there. He didn't stop. He had his driver slow, briefly, naturally, the way traffic sometimes moved on a narrow street, and he looked. She was inside. He could see her through the glass, moving between racks with an ease that suggested she knew the space the way you only knew a place you'd built something in. She was talking to a customer, maybe, or to herself, and whatever she was saying made her gesture with one hand, animated, certain. The car moved on. Do-yoon faced forward. Curiosity, he reminded himself. Controlled. Rational. Temporary. By Friday he knew her hours. Studio opened at 10. She arrived, based on his observations, between 9:40 and 9:50, always a few minutes before unlocking, always with something in her hand. Coffee, once. Paper bag, twice. Earphones in. Pace un'uried. She didn't rush. That kept striking him. The way she moved through a city that never stopped moving, completely unbothered by its pace. Seoul ran on urgency. Most people who came here either adapted to that speed or got swallowed by it. Abena Obinna appeared to have looked at the city's rhythm, considered it politely, and decided to keep her own. He found that inexplicably, irritatingly compelling. He had spent years surrounded by people who adjusted to him, who read his energy and mirrored it back carefully, strategically. Even his closest associates moved around him like men navigating an open current, always aware, always adjusting. She would not do that. He didn't know how he knew. He simply did. On Saturday evening, Do-yoon sat at his desk with the city burning orange outside his window and made a decision. He had observed long enough. Observation had its place. It was the foundation of everything he did. But it had limits. You could study a file until the paper wore thin and still not know the thing that mattered. The way a person moved under pressure. The way they spoke when they weren't performing. The texture of who they actually were beneath the data. He wanted to know. Not from a distance. Not through glass or documents or second-hand reports. He wanted to stand in the same room as Abena Obinna and understand. Finally, completely, why a woman who didn't know he existed had quietly taken up more space in his mind than anyone who did. He reached for his phone, pulled up the studio's address, set it down, stood at the window for a long moment, looking out at the city he controlled, every shadow of it, every current running beneath its polished surface. Then he picked the phone back up. Tomorrow, he decided. He would go in. He told himself it was just to satisfy the curiosity. He almost believed it. He almost didn't go in. He sat in the car for 4 minutes outside the studio, engine off, driver dismissed for the hour, and looked at the storefront through the windshield the way he usually looked at things he was about to acquire. Measuring. Calculating exit points and variables before committing to an entrance. It was a fashion studio. The variables were minimal. He got out of the car. The bell above the door was small and unassuming, the kind that announced without demanding. The interior was warmer than he expected. Not temperature, atmosphere. The space had been arranged with intention. Racks spaced deliberately, fabrics grouped by color and weight. A few statement pieces displayed on forms near the window where the natural light hit them best. It smelled faintly of cedar and something floral he couldn't immediately name. It was, he noted, the kind of space that reflected the person who curated it. He was still taking inventory when she appeared from behind a rack near the back. Abena Obinna. In person, the work permit photo had done her a quiet injustice. She moved differently than he had expected. Not the careful, performance-aware movement of someone who knew they were being watched, but the loose, grounded ease of someone entirely at home in their own body. She was wearing something simple, wide-leg trousers, a fitted top, and her braids were pinned up today, a few loose at the sides of her face. She looked up and paused. It was brief, a half second, maybe less, but Do-yoon caught it. Not recognition, something else. The particular stillness of a person whose instincts had just registered an input their conscious mind hadn't processed yet. She recovered smoothly. "Hi," she said. her voice warm and professionally easy. "Welcome in." Do-yoon stepped further inside. "Thank you." She watched him for just a moment longer than a standard customer greeting required. Then she moved toward the front rack, giving him space but not too much. "Looking for anything specific?" she asked. "Or just browsing?" "A jacket," he said. She turned toward a midsection rack, already scanning.
Occasion?
"Or just something to have. Does it matter?" She glanced back at him, and something shifted in her expression. Not offense, but recalibration. Like she had just quietly revised her first read of him and found the second one more interesting. "It matters for the fit," she said simply. "A jacket you wear to a dinner sits differently than one you wear because you like it. Different structure. Different intention." He looked at her. "Boardroom," he said. "You don't look like you need help dressing for a boardroom." "No," he agreed. She smiled at that, brief, contained, and pulled a charcoal piece from the rack. Structured shoulders, clean lapel, the kind of tailoring that didn't announce itself. "Try this one," she said, holding it out. He took it without looking at it. He was looking at her. "You're not going to tell me why that one? You seem like someone who prefers to form his own conclusions," she said. "I didn't want to bias you." Do-yoon was quiet for a moment. "Most people lead with the sell," he said. "Most people are trying to make a sale," Abena replied, turning back to the rack. "I'm trying to make a good match. Different motivation." He said nothing to that, but he turned the jacket over in his hands with slightly more attention than before. He didn't try it on. He wasn't there for a jacket. They both operated on some level of awareness around that fact, though neither said so. He moved through the space at a measured pace, pausing at things that caught his eye, asking occasional questions that were less about the clothing and more, she would later think about watching how she answered. She answered freely. That was simply how she was built. She had never seen the point in performing smallness to make other people comfortable. If someone asked her something, she responded with the full version of her thoughts, not the edited one. If a customer had bad taste, she told them gently and redirected. If a piece didn't suit someone, she said so. It had lost her a few sales over the years. She had decided early that was an acceptable loss. "This one," she said at one point, holding a deep navy piece against the light. "This is the one you'd actually wear." "You sound certain." "I am." "Based on what?" She looked at him directly, the way she had a habit of doing, without the social softening most people applied to direct eye contact. "Based on the fact that you've touched exactly 3 things in this store and put all of them back the same way you picked them up. You're not someone who commits to things lightly. You'd want something that earns it." The silence that followed was a beat too long. "That's an interesting observation," Do-yoon said. "From someone who met me 4 minutes ago." "I've been dressing people for 4 years," Abena said, unbothered. "You learn to read faster than the conversation moves." He studied her face. She held the look without flinching, without performing confidence. Simply having it, which was an entirely different thing. There was no awareness of him as a threat in her eyes. No social calculación. Just a woman standing in her own studio, comfortable in her own authority, waiting to see what he'd do with the truth she just offered him. Something in his chest registered it before his mind did. He took the navy jacket. "I'll think about it," he said. "Take your time," she replied. He stayed another 10 minutes. The conversation moved surfaces and textures, the particular quality of Korean wool in winter, the way certain colors shifted under artificial versus natural light. She spoke about fabric the way some people spoke about people, with genuine attention and a kind of affection that wasn't self-conscious. He said little, but he listened to everything. He watched the way she moved her hands when she explained something she cared about. The way her expression didn't perform enthusiasm. It simply had it, naturally, like a person who hadn't yet learned to be embarrassed by the things they loved. He found it, quietly, against every calculation, disarming. Not dangerous. Not a weakness he could file and set aside. Just disarming. Like a room where the lighting was different from every other room you'd been in, and you couldn't immediately explain why, only that it made you see things more clearly. He left without buying anything. At the door, he paused. "You're very hard to read," Abena said behind him, light but genuine. He turned slightly. That's intentional. Why? He held her gaze for one measured moment. Because being understood can be dangerous. She tilted her head. Something moved behind her eyes, not fear, not flattery. Just thought. Honest, unperformed consideration. Or maybe, she said quietly, you're just used to people being afraid of you. He didn't answer. He walked out. The bell above the door chimed once behind him. Outside, the city moved at its usual pace. Indifferent, relentless. Loud in the way Seoul was always loud beneath its polished surface. Do-yoon walked to where his car was waiting, got in, and sat in the quiet for a long moment before saying anything. His driver didn't ask. Do-yoon looked straight ahead. She had said it without armor, without strategy. Just laid it down in front of him like it was the most obvious thing in the world, and waited to see what he'd do with it. Nobody did that. Tomorrow, he said finally. Same time. The driver nodded once and pulled into traffic. Do-yoon did not look back at the studio as they passed it. He didn't need to. He was already planning what he'd say when he walked through that door again. The problem, the one he wasn't ready to name yet, was that, for the first time in longer than he could remember, he wasn't entirely sure who would be in control of the conversation. He came back the next day, and the day after that. By the fourth visit, Abena had stopped pretending she was surprised to hear the bell above the door and see him walk through it. By the fifth, she had stopped reaching for the professional warmth she reserved for new customers, the practiced welcome, the careful distance, and had replaced it with something simpler. She just looked up and said, "You again." Do-yoon had said nothing to that the first time she did it. He had simply moved to his usual position, the midsection rack, the one closest to the window, and begun the familiar performance of a man browsing without intention. The second time she said it, something at the corner of his mouth had shifted slightly. She filed that away. It started with small things. The way she learned, without being told, that he preferred direct answers over softened ones. That if she said, "That cut doesn't suit you," he received it more cleanly than perhaps something else might work better. Most of her customers needed the cushion. He didn't. She adjusted without ceremony. In return, he stopped pretending to browse. By the third visit, he had dropped the performance entirely. He would come in, move to the window side of the studio where the afternoon light came through at its best angle, and simply exist in the space. Sometimes he looked at pieces. Mostly he watched her work. She worked the way she did everything, without self-consciousness. She moved between customers and tasks with a fluid economy of motion. Never rushed but never idle, talking with her hands when something interested her and going quiet in that particular way she had when she was focused. A kind of productive silence. The silence of someone whose inner world was busy even when the outer one was still. Do-yoon had not been around that kind of person in a long time. He was not sure he had ever been around that kind of person. The inside joke arrived accidentally on a Thursday. She had been recommending a structured coat to a customer. A man in his 50s who clearly trusted his wife's taste more than his own, and had said, with a completely straight face, "The cut is confident without being convinced of itself. Not everyone can wear that." The customer had nodded seriously, interpreting it as a compliment. Do-yoon, standing 6 feet away, had understood it differently. He waited until the customer moved to the fitting room. Then, without looking up from the fabric he was pretending to examine, "Not everyone can wear that." Abena turned, caught the echo, caught the intent. She pressed her lips together. Not quite a smile, not quite suppressed laughter, but something that lived in the precise middle. "I stand by it as a coat description." "Completely," he said. "Completely," she agreed. After that, it became a thing between them, a quiet shorthand, deployed rarely and always with plausible deniability. She would say something that landed on 2 levels simultaneously, and he would acknowledge the second one with a word or a look, and they would both move on as though nothing had passed between them. It was, Do-yoon recognized distantly, the closest thing to play he had engaged in years. He didn't examine that. He simply let it exist. What he did examine, quietly, methodically, in the controlled hours of his evenings, was her. Not the file. He had long since memorized the file. He examined the parts of her that the file hadn't captured and never could. The way she disagreed with people. Cleanly, without apology but also without cruelty. She seemed to operate on the principle that a person could be wrong and still deserve their dignity intact. He had watched her redirect a customer's terrible instinct 3 times in one afternoon without once making the customer feel small. It required a particular kind of intelligence, social, emotional, precise, that most people never developed because they were too busy being right to bother being kind. The way she handled silence. Most people, in his experience, were uncomfortable with it. They filled it, performed through it, used noise as armor. Abena moved through silence the way she moved through her studio. Naturally. Like it was simply another texture of a room and not something that needed to be fixed. The way she laughed, not often, but when it came fully. No performance. No calibration for audience. Just the thing itself. He found himself more than once manufacturing the conditions for it. He noted this. He did not stop doing it. It was on a Wednesday 3 weeks in that she said it. They had been talking about nothing significant, a disagreement about whether a particular shade of olive was versatile or limiting, and he had made some comment, flat and final in the way his comments tended to land, that had closed the discussion without invitation. She had gone quiet for a moment. Then, "You do that a lot." "Do what?" "End conversations like you're issuing a verdict." She wasn't angry. She was observational. The way she got when something genuinely interested her. Like the discussion is over because you've decided it is. "It was a minor point," he said. "The point isn't the point," Abena replied. She set down the fabric she was folding and looked at him directly, in that way she had, without armor, without calculation, just full attention. "You're used to people not pushing back, aren't you?" It wasn't quite a question. Do-yoon held her gaze. "Most people prefer not to. Because they're afraid of you," she said simply. The words landed the same way they had the first time she'd said something like it. Not as an accusation, not as a challenge. Just as an observation delivered with the confidence of someone who had already decided it was true, and was simply noting it aloud. He didn't answer. "I'm not," she added. Quiet. Matter of fact. "In case that wasn't clear." "It's clear," he said. She nodded once, picked up the fabric again, and returned to folding it. The conversation moved on. But something in Do-yoon's chest did not move on with it. It stayed exactly where it had landed, fixed, unfiled, refusing the categorization he kept trying to assign it. She saw through him. Not the empire. Not the reputation. Not the careful architecture of distance he had spent years constructing around himself. She looked at the man operating beneath all of it and responded to that. Directly, without ceremony, without fear. He had no framework for it. He was beginning to think he needed one. That evening he stayed until she began closing up. He hadn't intended to. He had a dinner, a meeting dressed as a dinner, the kind where every word carried weight and the wrong pause could shift a negotiation. He had been aware of the time. He had meant to leave at 6. It was 6:43 when he finally stood. Abena was locking a display case, her back to him, humming something low and unhurried under her breath. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked without turning around. Do-yoon paused. "Yes," he said. She nodded, still not turning. "Then good night, Do-yoon." First name. No title. No careful distance. Just his name. In her voice. Like it belonged there. He left. Outside. The city pressed in from all sides. Noise. Light. The endless machinery of Seoul running its usual operations beneath the surface. He stood on the pavement for 3 seconds longer than necessary before getting into the waiting car. His driver said nothing. Do-yoon looked straight ahead. Something is shifting, he thought. He did not say it was a problem. That, he recognized, distantly and with the particular clarity of a man who had spent years outrunning exactly this, was the problem. She almost didn't stay late. The studio had been quiet all afternoon. A slow Thursday, the kind where foot traffic thinned and the hours stretched long and unhurried. By 7 she had finished the inventory recount, steamed 2 pieces that had come back from a client, and reorganized the accessories wall for the 3rd time that month simply because she liked the way it looked when everything was where it should be. There was no reason to stay past 7:30. She stayed anyway. There was something about the studio after hours that she had never been able to fully explain. The particular quality of the silence, the way the city sounds outside became background rather than foreground, the feeling of a space that was entirely hers. She had built this place from almost nothing. She swept its floors and chose its music and arranged its windows with her own hands. In a city that hadn't been built for her, this room was the one place that felt unconditionally like home. She turned the display lights down to low, pulled her playlist to something slow and ambient, and began the final lockdown. Display case, register, back storage door. She was reaching for her jacket when the front door opened. She hadn't unlocked it. 3 men walked in. They didn't browse. They didn't speak politely. They moved through the entrance with the particular deliberateness of people who had already decided what the room was for and it wasn't shopping. The first one was broad, unhurried, his eyes doing a slow sweep of the space before settling on her. The second closed the door behind them. The third moved to the left, positioning himself near the secondary exit without being asked. Abena registered all of it in under 4 seconds. Her hand dropped from her jacket. "We're closed," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was quietly grateful for that. "We know," the first man said. The second one turned the lock on the door. The sound of it was very small in the silence of the room. "We're here about Do-yoon," the first man said. Something cold moved through her chest. She kept her expression still. "I don't know anyone by that name," she said carefully. The first man smiled. It didn't reach anything above his mouth. "You should. He's been in the store 8 times in 3 weeks. That's not nothing. People come into stores," Abena said. "That's what stores are for. Not his kind of people." The man took 1 step forward. Not aggressive, measured. The kind of step designed to remind you that he could take more whenever he chose. Do-yoon doesn't have hobbies. He doesn't have routines. When he starts doing something new, a pause. People pay attention. "Then those people should talk to him," she said. "Not me. We'd rather start here." The third man shifted near the exit. Abena's eyes tracked the movement without moving her head. She had 3 options and limited time and no weapon, and the nearest person who would hear her if she screamed was probably half a building away. She catalogued this without panic. Panic was a luxury. Right now she needed her mind clear and her feet ready. "Whatever you think is happening between me and whoever you're looking for," she said, keeping her voice even, "you have the wrong person." "Maybe," the first man said, "but we'll sort that out somewhere less public. I'm not going anywhere with you." He looked at her with something that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite irritation. The expression of a man who was used to compliance and found its absence mildly inconvenient. "That's not really a choice you're making tonight," he said. The third man stepped forward. The glass door shattered. Not broke, shattered. A single explosive impact that sent fragments across the studio floor in a cascade of sound. And then there was motion in the doorway, fast and certain, the kind of movement that didn't telegraph itself or hesitate at thresholds. Do-yoon stepped through what remained of the door. Abena had seen him in this space 8 times. She had read the stillness in him, the control, the careful economy of a man who never spent more than was necessary. She had thought she understood the shape of him, composed, measured, the kind of dangerous that lived quietly beneath a polished surface. She had not understood. The man who stepped through that door was not the man from the studio. The composure was still there, but it had transformed into something else entirely. Something colder, more final. His expression carried no anger, no urgency, none of the emotional texture that usually accompanied violence. Just clarity. The particular, terrible clarity of a man who had already decided how this ended and was simply executing the steps. The first man turned. He didn't finish turning. What followed was not a fight in any conventional sense. There was no exchange, no back and forth, no negotiation of force. Do-yoon moved through the room with a precision that was almost mechanical, each action the minimum necessary, nothing wasted, nothing performed. The first man went down before he could recalibrate. The second reached for something at his waist and didn't reach it. "Which one of you touched her?" His voice was quiet. That was the thing that made it terrible. Not the volume, not the rage, but the absolute quiet of it. The tone of a man who was not asking out of emotion, who was asking because the answer would determine a specific outcome, and he intended to arrive at that outcome regardless. Nobody answered. The third man looked at the other two on the floor and made the calculation quickly. He stepped back. Do-yoon looked at him for one long moment. "Leave," he said. "Tell whoever sent you that this conversation happened. Tell them exactly what they saw." The man left. The bell above the broken door made a single, fractured sound as the frame shifted. Silence filled the studio. Abena stood where she had been standing. She hadn't moved, hadn't retreated, some stubborn, fundamental part of her having decided that she would not let fear move her feet even when everything else in her was shaking. She was shaking now. Quietly, internally, the delayed arrival of adrenaline doing what it always did once the immediate moment passed. Do-yoon turned to face her. The coldness receded, not entirely, not immediately, but enough. Enough that the man she recognized moved back into his eyes, looked at her, and took in whatever her face was showing him. "Are you hurt?" he asked.
No.
Her voice was steady. She was still grateful for that. "You're not just a businessman." It wasn't a question. "No," he said. "Then what are you?" He looked at her, really looked at her in the way he had a habit of doing that she had grown used to without fully understanding. Like he was reading something beneath the surface of whatever she presented. "I'm the man who should have stayed in that car," he said. Something shifted in her expression. "What?" 3 weeks ago. Gangnam. You used my window." The recognition arrived slowly, then all at once. The charcoal sedan. The golden afternoon. Her own reflection looking back at her. "That was your car," she said. "Yes." The silence between them was a different kind now. Not the comfortable silence of the studio, not the easy quiet they had built over weeks of careful conversation. This was the silence of a thing that had been hidden finally stepping into the light. Heavy with everything it changed. "You should stay away from me," she said softly. "I know." He didn't move. The glass from the door lay across her studio floor, catching the low light in fragments. Small, scattered, irretrievable. "Then go," she said. He didn't. And standing in the wreckage of the room that had felt most like home, Abena Obinna looked at the man in front of her and understood. Clearly, finally, with no room left for comfortable ambiguity. That Do-yoon was dangerous, and that she was already far too close. The silence after violence has a texture to it. It isn't peaceful. It isn't relief. It sits in the air like smoke after a fire, heavy, strange, carrying the smell of something that cannot be undone. Abena had never been inside that kind of silence before tonight. She had never stood in a room where 3 men had been put on the floor like problems being solved, where the only sound left was her own breathing and the soft creak of the studio's overhead light swaying slightly from the disturbance. She had never watched someone she thought she knew become someone else entirely. Do-yoon stood with his back partially to her now, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve with the same quiet precision he used for everything. Like what had just happened was administrative. Like the 3 men folded across her studio floor were minor inconveniences he had simply reorganized. Abena's hands were not shaking. She made sure of that. "You're not just a businessman," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. She was grateful for that. At least her body was giving her something to work with tonight. Do-yoon turned. He looked at her the way he always did, fully, without apology, without the social performance of pretending not to notice things. But something was different now. The composed mask he wore so naturally, the one she had spent weeks quietly trying to crack with questions and challenges, and the simple act of treating him like a person instead of a presence. It had slipped. Just slightly. Just enough. "No," he said. One word. But the weight of it filled the entire room. "Then what are you?" She needed to hear him say it. Not because she hadn't already understood what she'd just witnessed. She wasn't naive. She wasn't fragile. And she hadn't survived 2 years alone in Seoul by refusing to see things clearly. She needed him to say it because she needed to know if he would. If he'd stand in the wreckage of this moment and finally stop performing honesty while hiding the most important things. Do-yoon looked at her for a long moment. Then, quietly, without drama, without deflection, The man who should have stayed in that car. Abena stilled. What? 3 days ago, he said. Late afternoon. Gangnam. You stopped at the curb outside a storefront. He paused. It was my car. The recognition moved across her face slowly, and then all at once. The charcoal gray sedan. The mirror-dark windows. The lipstick she'd applied with full confidence while talking to herself like no one was watching. Because she had been so certain no one was watching. That was your car, she said. Not a question. A recalibration. Yes. And you were inside it. Yes. She let out a breath that almost became a laugh. The kind that rises when something is too absurd to process as anything else. She pressed her fingers briefly to her lips. The same lips she had painted plum against his window while he sat 3 inches away in silence. So you've been, what? Watching me since then? Coming into the studio? The conversations? All of it. I've been trying to understand, he said. Why I cannot stop thinking about you. The honesty in it was almost violent. Not because it was aggressive, but because Do-yoon was a man who measured every word like currency, who said nothing he hadn't already decided to say, and who had just handed her something unguarded without any visible strategy behind it. That was somehow more disorienting than the 3 men on her floor. Abena crossed her arms. Not defensively. She needed something to hold on to while she thought. You had me investigated. Yes. You changed your schedule to come into my studio. Yes. And tonight. How did you know they were here? I monitor threats in proximity to things that matter to me. The phrasing landed carefully between them. Things that matter to me. She held his gaze. You shouldn't have come. They would not have left without you. You don't know that. I do, he said simply. And the certainty in it, not arrogant, just factual, made her stomach tighten in a way she didn't want to examine too closely. Because he wasn't wrong. She had seen it in the way those men had moved, in the way they'd said her name in the locked door. He was right and she hated that he was right. She turned away from him slightly, looked at the shattered glass near the entrance, the scattered garments, the studio she had spent months making feel like hers in a city that had required so much of her just to stay. Who were they? She asked. People who use other people to send messages. And the message was about you. Yes. She nodded slowly, processing, stacking it all against everything she had built in her mind about him. The quiet presence, the stillness, the way he listened like he was cataloging, the way he'd said being understood can be dangerous, and looked at her like she was already too close to understanding him. She turned back. You should stay away from me, she said softly. Something moved behind his eyes. I know. I'm not a part of your world. I don't want to be. I came to Seoul to build something clean, something mine. I know, he said again. Then go. He didn't move. The space between them was small, 5, maybe 6 feet of studio floor with a broken door behind him and her whole evening scattered around them. And yet it felt like the most consequential geography she had ever stood in. Do-yoon. It was the first time she had said his name directly like that. Like an instruction. Like she was testing whether it would make him real or make him leave. She wasn't entirely sure which she wanted. He looked at her with an openness she had not seen on him before. Not vulnerability in the way of weakness, but in the way of someone who had just arrived at a decision that cost them something, and had made it anyway. I have never, he said carefully, done anything in my life that I could not justify with numbers, outcomes, probability. She waited. I cannot justify this. The quiet between them was different now. Still heavy, but with something other than smoke in it. Something that had no clean name, that sat precisely in the space between fear and gravity, between the instinct to run and the deeper, older instinct to stay. Abena looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time since he had walked through that shattered door, she let herself feel both things at once. The fear and the pull. Do-yoon didn't move toward her. He simply stayed, present, still, as if he had made his choice and was now prepared to let her make hers. Outside, Seoul kept moving. Inside, everything paused. And for a man who had built his entire life on never choosing anything over power, he had just chosen her. The question now was what that was going to cost them both. He started walking her home. Not formally. Not with announcement or arrangement. It simply began the evening after the studio, Do-yoon's car appearing at the end of her block at the precise time her shift ended, parked quietly at the curb the way it had been that first afternoon, when she hadn't known he was inside it. She stood on the pavement the first time and looked at the car for a long moment. Then she walked over and got in. Neither of them spoke about it. Neither of them named it. It existed the way certain things between two careful people exist, acknowledged in behavior, protected by silence. By the fourth evening, she stopped pretending to be surprised. They talked. That was the thing she hadn't expected. Not the protection, not the quiet rearrangement of his schedule around the edges of her life, but the talking. Do-yoon, who measured words like a man who had learned early that language was a liability, talked to her. Not strategy, not deflection, not the polished surface conversation he offered the rest of the world. Real things. One evening they sat parked along the Han River. Neither of them suggesting it, the car simply stopping there as though it had decided for them, and she asked him where he was from originally, before Seoul had made him into whatever he was now. He was quiet for a moment. Busan, he said. My father had a shipping business. Small, legitimate, barely surviving. A pause. I watched him bow to men who had less intelligence but more cruelty, and I decided I would never be in that position. So you became the man others bow to. I became something that couldn't be touched. Abena turned to look at him in the low evening light. How's that working for you? His mouth moved barely. The ghost of something. Less effectively than it used to. She smiled and looked back at the river. He watched her do it. She had a way of receiving difficult things. Hard truths, strange silences, the weight of who he was, without flinching and without making a performance of her courage. She simply held them, turned them over, and kept going. He had never met anyone who made him feel simultaneously exposed and entirely safe in that exposure. It was deeply inconvenient. My mother used to say Lagos prepares you for everything, she said eventually. The noise, the hustle, the way nothing is ever given, you have to pull it toward you with both hands. She paused. Seoul reminded me of that. Different language, same lesson. You miss it. Every day. She didn't say it with sadness, just fact. But I also built something here, and I'm not ready to let go of it. He understood that. More precisely, he felt it, which was different. He was not gentle with the world. He never had been. But with her, something in him recalibrated without permission. He noticed the things that made her day harder. The studio's broken back lock she hadn't gotten repaired. The late shipment from her supplier that left her stressed for 3 days. And he resolved them quietly, without ceremony, without requiring gratitude. She noticed anyway. You fixed my lock, she said one afternoon, not looking up from the garment she was pinning. The mechanism was faulty. Do-yoon. It was a security risk. Do-yoon. He met her eyes. She was looking at him with that expression. The one that saw past everything he offered as explanation and landed directly on the truth beneath it. He had no adequate defense against that expression. He was fairly certain no one had ever developed one. You're welcome, he said finally. She laughed. Full and warm, and went back to her work. He stood there for a moment longer than necessary. It was a Wednesday evening when it happened. They were in the studio after hours. She had stayed late finishing alterations on a client order, and he had arrived at closing time, as he did now, and simply stayed. He sat on the stool near the work table while she moved around the space with quiet efficiency, putting things in order, talking to him over her shoulder about nothing important. A difficult client, a fabric supplier she loved, something funny she had overheard on the metro. He was watching her the way he always watched her. Fully. She turned to say something and stopped. He was closer than she'd registered. She had moved without tracking his movement, and now there was almost nothing between them. His eyes were on her face with an intensity that was no longer ambiguous, no longer something she could comfortably categorize as unreadable. She knew exactly what it was. You're doing it again, she said quietly. What? Looking at me like that. Like what? She held his gaze. Like you're trying to decide something. I already decided, he said. 3 days ago. Weeks ago. Possibly the moment you smiled at yourself in my window. Her breath shifted. This is dangerous, she said. You said it yourself. Being understood is dangerous, he finished. Yes. Then. Abena. Just her name. Quiet and complete the way he said everything, like he had considered it from every angle and arrived at it as a conclusion. She didn't finish her sentence. He reached up slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back, and with careful fingers, moved a loose braid from her face. His hand stayed at the edge of her jaw. Not demanding, not performing, just present the way he had learned to be present with her, fully without agenda. She looked at him and felt both things again. The same two things she'd been carrying since the night of the broken door. Fear, and something far more honest than fear. She closed the remaining distance. The kiss was not dramatic. It didn't need to be. It was quiet and certain, the kind that doesn't announce itself because it was always going to happen, the kind that feels less like a beginning and more like an arrival. His hand settled gently at the side of her face. She held the front of his jacket with fingers that were steady. When they separated, neither of them moved far. I can't promise you safe, he said against the quiet. I'm not asking for safe, she said. I've never had safe. I'm asking for honest. Something crossed his face. Something rare and unguarded. That, he said, I can do. She nodded slowly. Outside, Seoul moved through its night. Indifferent, luminous, carrying its secrets the way it always did, beneath glass and light and the hum of a city that never fully slept. Inside the studio, two people who had no reasonable business choosing each other stood in the wreckage of every practical argument against it, and chose each other anyway, not because it was safe, not because it was simple, but because some things, the truest things, don't wait for permission. And this had stopped waiting a long time ago. The first sign was so small that most people would have missed it. Do-yoon didn't miss it. He noticed it on a Wednesday. A gray sedan, different plates from the previous Tuesday, parked on the opposite side of the street from Abena's studio for the second time in 4 days. Not suspicious on its own. Seoul had gray sedans the way it had convenience stores everywhere, unremarkable. But Do-yoon had not survived this long by dismissing patterns, and this one had a particular quality he recognized immediately. Patience. Whoever was watching wasn't in a hurry. They weren't gathering information for an immediate move. They were studying. Building a picture slowly, carefully, the way you did when the target wasn't the objective, when the target was the leverage. He said nothing to Abena that morning when he passed through the studio. He bought a scarf he didn't need, stayed 20 minutes, and left the way he always did. Unhurried, unreadable. But on the way back to his car, he made 3 calls. By Thursday, he had names. By Friday, he understood the shape of the problem entirely. His enemies had always known Do-yoon was disciplined. What made him dangerous wasn't just power, it was the absence of exploitable attachment. No family he acknowledged. No woman he visited more than once. No location outside of business that held his presence with any regularity. Until now, he had broken his own architecture. Not dramatically, not publicly, but the people who watched him for a living had sharp eyes and long memories, and 3 weeks of changed schedules, adjusted routes, and repeated appearances at a small fashion studio in Itaewon had told them everything. Do-yoon had something he cared about, and in his world, that was the only weapon anyone ever truly needed. He told her on a Saturday, not everything, but enough. I need you to stay away from the studio for a while, he said. They were standing near the rear entrance, the city noise filtering softly through the alley door she'd propped open for air. Abena looked at him steadily. How long is a while? Until I've handled something. What's something? He held the pause a beat too long and she caught it, the slight recalibration behind his eyes, the decision about how much truth to offer. Do-yoon. There are people who have noticed that I come here. She processed that in silence. Then, and coming here makes me a problem. It makes you a target, he said. Which is different. Is it? She turned slightly, her arms folding the way they did when she was thinking hard and holding herself together at the same time. Because from where I'm standing, I can't work out if I'm unsafe because of the world you're in, or because of you specifically. The directness of it landed cleanly. Am I safe with you? She said quietly. Or from you? He didn't deflect. He didn't reach for the composed non-answer she had learned he kept ready for most things. Both have been true, he said. I am trying to make only one of them true now. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, a delivery bike buzzed past. Someone laughed 2 streets over. The ordinary world continuing its ordinary business around the edges of this conversation. Try faster, she said finally. He moved quickly after that. He repositioned assets. Tightened surveillance on the studio, on her apartment building, on the 3-block radius between them. He placed 2 of his most reliable men in rotation. Not visible, never visible, but present. A net she would never know existed. For 6 days it held. The 7th day was a Tuesday. Abena had stayed late again, the way she always did when a project caught her attention. A custom commission, structured jacket, deep green, the kind of work that required the studio quiet and the lighting low. She had her earphones in, a playlist running, her hands moving with the focused ease of someone completely inside their craft. She didn't hear the first car pull up outside. She didn't notice the feed from the exterior camera freeze. Not go dark, not glitch. Simply freeze, holding a single clean frame of an empty street on a loop while the street itself became something else entirely. She didn't know that 40 meters away, the man Do-yoon had placed on her corner had received a message that pulled him half a block in the wrong direction. A message constructed specifically to move him, timed to the second. She didn't know any of it. She was thinking about the jacket collar when the back door opened. She pulled one earphone out. Hello? No answer. She set the jacket down slowly, turned. The back door was open. She was sure she had locked it after the last delivery. She crossed the studio toward it, reaching for her phone on the table as she passed, and then stopped. 3 men. Through the front entrance this time, which she had also locked, which meant the lock had been dealt with before she'd heard a single sound. They moved with a quietness that was entirely deliberate, spreading slightly as they entered the way people do when they've been trained to cover exits without being told. She recognized the quality of their stillness. She had seen it before. Her grip tightened on her phone. Don't, one of them said. Not loudly, almost politely, which was somehow worse. There's nothing in that phone that helps you right now. Her mind moved fast. Back door, still open, but a 4th figure had already stepped through it into the studio, and the geometry of the room closed itself around her with a finality that her body understood before her thoughts could catch up. I don't know what you want, she said, steady, controlled. She had promised herself after the last time that they would not have her fear before they had anything else. You don't need to, the man said. This isn't about you. Then let me leave. It is about someone who has been making very costly decisions lately. A brief pause. You're the consequence. She moved anyway, one sharp step toward the sidewall, toward the fire panel, toward anything. But the 4th man was faster than the distance between them should have allowed, and her phone was gone from her hand before she fully registered the motion. And then there was an arm across her path and a grip on her wrist that wasn't violent but was absolute. She pulled. It didn't matter. Don't make this harder, the first man said, almost gently. The studio light blurred above her. Someone killed the lights entirely, and Gangnam kept moving outside. 1,000 people, 1,000 lives, none of them close enough to matter. While Abena Obinna was walked through the back door of her own studio and into a waiting car that had already started moving before the door fully closed. Her jacket, deep green, collar unfinished, remained on the table inside. And somewhere across the city, Do-yoon's phone began to ring. The call lasted 11 seconds. Do-yoon listened to every one of them without moving. Standing in the center of his office on the 14th floor, the city of Seoul spread out behind the floor-to-ceiling glass like a painting that had suddenly lost all meaning. His driver's voice came through tight and careful, the way voices get when the person speaking understands the weight of what they're delivering. Studio empty. Back door open. Her phone on the floor. 11 seconds. He ended the call and stood completely still for a moment that had no measurable length. The stillness didn't last. Not because he broke. Do-yoon did not break, had not broken in longer than he could trace, had built the architecture of himself specifically to prevent it. But something beneath the architecture shifted with a violence that had nothing to do with sound or movement. A structural thing. The kind of shift that doesn't announce itself until you take a step and realize the floor you were standing on is no longer what it was. He set his phone down on the desk with a precision that was almost absurd given what was happening inside him. Then he picked it back up. "Get me CO." His voice came out the way it always did, level, low, final. The voice his men knew. The voice that meant the conversation was already over and the only remaining question was execution. But his hand, just briefly, just for the 3 seconds before CO answered, was not entirely steady. He noticed it, filed it, said nothing about it to anyone. Within 20 minutes, his office had transformed. 3 screens running simultaneous feeds. A city map overlaid with contact networks, flagged locations, known assets belonging to the men whose names he had acquired 6 days ago and apparently not moved on fast enough. CO stood to his left, silent and attentive. 2 others waited near the door. Do-yoon stood at the center of it all, moving through information with a speed and precision that his team had witnessed before, but never quite like this. There was something different in the quality of his focus tonight. Usually when Do-yoon worked, the temperature in the room dropped. He became efficient, cold, almost algorithmic. Tonight the temperature didn't drop. Tonight it burned. "The gray sedan from Wednesday," he said. "Registration traces to a shell company registered in Busan. Pull every property, every vehicle, every name attached to that shell back 4 years. I want the full structure by midnight." "Yes, sir." "The man I had on her corner. Where did they send him?" CO pulled the message log. "False report of an altercation 2 blocks north. Came through a number registered to a convenience store on that street, which had been purchased as a burner 3 weeks ago." "Yes. So they've been building this for 3 weeks." Do-yoon said it quietly, to himself more than the room. 3 weeks. Since before he'd even acknowledged to himself what Abena represented. They had identified the pattern before he had finished forming it. The camera freeze? Technical or physical override? Technical. Remote signal. Professional grade. He nodded once. This was not street-level retaliation. This was a message engineered by someone who understood his systems, which narrowed the field considerably and made the situation both simpler and significantly more dangerous. "Find her," he said. "Everything else is secondary." CO cleared the room at some point. Do-yoon didn't register when. He stood alone at the window for a moment that he would not have permitted himself under any previous version of his life. His reflection ghosted across the glass. The city behind it, indifferent and luminous, doing what cities do. He thought about probability. He had built everything he owned on it. Probability, pattern, leverage, control. He had never invested in anything that couldn't be quantified, never moved toward anything he hadn't already mapped 3 outcomes ahead. It was not coldness, it was architecture. A system designed to keep him standing when everything around him fell. He had calculated on some level that Abena was a risk. He had chosen her anyway. What he had failed to calculate, what no system he possessed had the language for, was that the risk was not to his empire. It was not to his networks or his reputation or the careful machinery of his public life. The risk had been to the part of him he'd stopped acknowledging existed. And now that part was the only thing driving him. She is no longer a curiosity. The thought arrived without softness, without the intellectual distance he usually maintained around things he felt but refused to name. She has not been a curiosity for a long time. He pressed one hand briefly against the cold glass. The memory came without invitation. Late afternoon. Gangnam in gold. A woman he had never seen before stepping up to his car window with the easy confidence of someone who owned whatever space she occupied. Not performing. Not aware. Simply present. Her braids catching the light. Her expression shifting between focus and private amusement as she fixed herself with the quiet seriousness of someone who believed she deserved to look exactly the way she wanted to look. And then the smile. That small, satisfied, entirely self-contained smile. The one she gave to her own reflection before she turned and walked away without a single glance back. He remembered the exact moment something had moved in his chest and he hadn't had a name for it. He had a name for it now. He had several. Do-yoon turned from the window. Seo was already back in the doorway, reading the shift in the room the way good lieutenants learn to, the way people learn to when their survival depends on accurate interpretation. "What do you need?" Seo asked. Do-yoon straightened his cuff, looked at the map on the screen, let his eyes trace the network of names and locations with the calm of someone who has already made every relevant decision and is now simply executing sequence. "Shut down their Busan operation first," he said. "Not as a warning, as a demonstration. And the others? They took something of mine." His voice was entirely even. "I want them to understand, before the end, exactly what that cost them." Seo nodded once and left. Do-yoon looked at the city one final time. He had spent years perfecting the art of feeling nothing, building a life on the clean, load-bearing logic of power and control, on the understanding that attachment was the only vulnerability that couldn't be armored against. He had been right about that. He had always been right about that. He simply hadn't anticipated her. Hadn't anticipated a woman who used his car window as a mirror and smiled at herself like the world owed her nothing and she owed it even less. Hadn't anticipated that 30 seconds of complete unawareness could dismantle in him what years of discipline had constructed. He hadn't been meant to fall, but he had. And now that he had, now that she had been taken from a room he was supposed to keep safe, now that his enemies had looked at the one unguarded thing in his life and decided it was a door, the world would burn for it. Every last part of it.